Hey all, we're here in the All Tech Service Shop on a Saturday doing some work, and while we were here I was reading through some comments and I saw some questions that I wanted to answer today. So we got a shock in the vise and let's get into it. Alright, so here we go. We got a shock. It's a little dirty. Race King of the Hammers. It's in. We're looking at it to do some work to it, but people ask me, how do I know where to set the crossover? And I have to be honest with you, I don't know where to set your crossover until we've done tuning day, figured out what it needs. But there's a pretty easy formula that we use to determine where the spring divider contacts the crossover rings in relationship to the shaft travel. And that may not seem like much, but for me, that allows me to know where in the travel, give or take a small margin of error, where in the travel we make contact, so we know where it's happening, where the crossover, we're crossing over from the combined rate to the singular lower rate. And so the formula is pretty easy. We know that we have 300 over 300, so rate times rate over rate plus rate is combined rate, and when they're the same rate, it's easy. You just divide it by 2 and you get 300 over 300 is a 150. So the formula that we use for to determine the ratio of travel between the spring divider and the shaft is upper rate divided by combined. So upper rate 300 divided by 150 is 2. So for every 2 inches of shaft travel, I get 1 inch of movement here, and we can relatively easily calculate that. If we know that the spring divider at full extension is 2 3/8 of an inch away from the spring divider. The crossover is 2 3/8 away from the spring divider. So we know 2.375. More calculatory stuff. 2.375 times 2 is 4.75. So that means we're going to move the shaft travel 4.75 inches. I don't know if you're seeing that. Let me see what the camera angle looks like. Let's get you down just a little bit more. Zoom in just a bit. So here we are with 2.375 inches, 2 3/8, and then times that by 2 is 4.75. So we know that at 4.75, that's how much, how soon we're getting to the crossover, which means we have, give or take, 5.5-ish inches of shaft travel left from 11-inch total. So we're about 50% of travel. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? So now that you know where you're hitting, you have some empirical data that you can document, and then you can go either side of it to see what the reaction of the car is for going up or down and that kind of thing. So let's talk about that a little bit. So we're with the shock. It's not in a vise, it's on a car. We're out in the desert, and the driver comes in and tells me,
get on top of the whoops. This car's just
skateboard.
It's
like a skateboard, yep, going across the truncated domes outside off.
Right when you're trying to get on top, you're almost on top, but it's just beating the dog shit out of you.
Front, something to the effect of the front end is really lazy. The back end overrides it. I feel like I'm driving downhill all the time, or a lot of times they'll say the back end is bucking, and there's several things that cause the buck. It's always excess force causing the back end to bounce off the ground. What's causing it, you don't know. But one thing that's difficult is we get out there and they complain about the back, complain about the back, complain about the back. And then you go for a ride or you watch it go by and you're like, all the back's caused by the front. So let's just say that the back is, it's not bottoming out, but they call it bucking. You go for a ride, it doesn't hit the bottom, it doesn't bounce off a compression event, it just bounces off a mid-travel. So there's two things you can do. You can say, okay, we'll raise the rear crossover and see if that helps. And so you've documented upper rate divided by combined. And remember, combined, rate times rate over rate plus rate. So let's just say it has a 200 over 250, so 111 inch-pound spring rate. That 200 divided by 111, about 1.8. Didn't do that math, did it in my head, I'm not good at that. So then you can figure out 1.88 inches of shaft travel for 1 inch of spring divider travel. And so what we do is we go, okay, you're contacting the spring, the upper spring, with 7 inches of shaft travel left. We have 8 3/4 of shaft travel at ride height. Sounds pretty early to me, just in travel numbers, because especially with a lot of these cars, UTVs are a classic example. A trailing arm rear suspension doesn't like crossover, doesn't want crossover. Unlike a one car with a true trailing arm that has that big moment change through the travel, you don't run any crossover. You just run them up out of the way and use a singular spring, only because with the big roll center change through travel, if you hit the crossover at the wrong time, the car goes ass over. It just lifts the back end really badly. UTVs are a little different because they are trailing arm, but usually the trailing arm's long. It's very long, and we race again on a track that we're on 35s, usually 33s, and all the guys in front of us, not all, but 200 guys in front of us were on 40s. Well, the rut's deep and we drag the skid, and we don't want to do that. So we need some catch. We don't want to catch it too early because it makes the back just lift and buck and do weird things. We want to catch it just enough time with the heavier spring to keep it from dragging the skid on the rut. If there's a big crown, it's going to drag. You have to move over side to side a little bit. But if it's not a big crown and it's dragging, we'll bring the crossover down so that it hits just after the trailing arm goes from inclined to inverted. As soon as it gets inverted, it doesn't have the tendency to throw the car over as bad as when you cross over and the rear trailing arm is still inverted. So that's one thing you can do. You try that, the whole car goes dead. You don't know why. But then you figure out, I do know why. Instead of changing the back, we'll leave the back where it is, and we'll get the front to be more lively. You start bringing the crossover down. You know where it was. You can then instead of 50% of travel, let's put it at 62% of travel. You do that math. Now you're at 62% of travel. Front becomes a little more lively. You're making progress. Back still good. The back gets less bucky. It's not really a buck, but less nose down because the front's staying up better. And so we woke up the front. The front's working good. We get it so it's working really good. We're happy. But there's something you need to check, and we'll get into that right now too. All right. So crossover. We're going to figure out how to figure. We've moved the crossover. And we move it, got the car pretty happy, but we want to make sure we're not coil binding. So we're going to show you here how to figure coil bind. So I'm going to take my caliper. Okay. And I'm going to measure the wire diameter. 0.53. So 0.53 wire diameter. Then I'm going to count the coils. So I'm going to the first full coil. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a half. 9.5 coils. 9.5 coils times 0.53 comes out to 5.035. So, okay, so now we know how high this whole spring is when it's collapsed, and there's no space. All this free space is taken up and it's collapsed, and the coils, the wire, all stacked on top of itself. You can tell if that's happening because there'll be, see, I drew this little Sharpie line, but there will be these lines in the powder coat right here, and usually you do see them a little on the first few coils right here, like this one's happening, and it will happen right there But if the ones in the middle have that, that means their spring is coil binding, and you don't want that. So we need to figure out how much room there is on the shock. Well, what we have is the spring column has to fit 5.03, so just over 5 inches. So the first measurement we're going to take is from the bottom of the shock to the spring divider, where the spring sits right there, and that's going to be 2.625. And then we're going to measure, I usually just turn the tape measure around and put it on 2.625 and measure up, and I get 5 1/8. So it's really close right now, and we knew this because this is a car that we worked on. But before we sent them out, we did this measurement. So it's 5 1/8. So that spring, the lower spring is running at a relatively high stress, and if you run a spring at a high stress level, their life is shorter. So we do need to keep that in mind. One of the reasons to go longer, lower spring, move the whole spring column up, as we can have all the same forces in the same positions, and use the spring at slightly less stress, and the life of the spring gets significantly longer as you start to reduce the stress, the stress it's operating at. Basically, these are all just numbers. So just as a comparison, let's just say that a spring operating at 100% stress has about 1 million cycles in it. That's not very far off-road. Long way on the road, but not very far off-road. But you get the stress down to 80%, and the cycle life way more than doubles, goes to like 5 million or something like that. These are all just numbers for comparison. So that's why sometimes you run a lot longer lower spring, and even though a shorter spring may save some weight and the rate is the same, even though it's lighter, you are using more of its potential each time, and so therefore the duty cycle is a little less. So that's that. So we know we're at 5 1/8. We're really close. We may talk to this car owner about going a slightly different spring combo. The spring combo works very well on lots of this particular shock, but there you go. So I'm gonna move the camera around and we'll do the math on the bench so you can see how bad I am at math, and we can walk through it and then you'll understand. So here we go. Let me see if you're gonna read this. So we know we have a rate of 300, and we're gonna times that by 300. And then we're going to divide that by 300 plus 300, and we're going to equal 150 inch-pound spring rate. So we have 150 inch-pound spring rate. So that means upper rate divided by combined. So we would just go on a new equation. Basically, 300 over 150 equals 2. So our motion ratio, shaft to divider, equals 2 to 1. 2 inches of shaft, 1 inch of spring divider. With that, you can calculate where you are just by measuring the shaft travel at ride height or full droop, and then the distance from the divider from the crossover rings. You can figure out where you're hitting, and then you can start playing with it from there. Pretty simple equation. Now coil bind. Coil bind is the amount of coils times the wire diameter. We know we have 0.53 inch wire times 9.5 winds, right? So that's D, and that's coils, DNC, equals 5.03. And then we're measuring two measurements on the shock. Hope you can see this. We're measuring from the bottom of the shock here to where that spring divider sits like this, right? The spring sits on it. It looks a little bit like that. Spring sits right there, here to here. And then we're measuring, spring divider also has an upper where it hits the crossover, and the crossover is up here somewhere. We're measuring from here to here, because this measurement plus that measurement is total room on the shock at coil bind. And we came out up with 5.125, which is very close, but is not coil binding. We're okay to run that. We would run that for a race. If we didn't have an option, we would probably advise car owner, car driver, prep guy to watch the springs, watch for sag, which the spring never loses rate unless it starts to break. It can lose length because the wire will take a bit of a memory and start to sag. We see that a lot in UTV stock springs that are, well, they always, manufacturers, they work really hard to get the right spring, but they have to make 3-4 million springs, and so they do it relatively cheaply, hot wound and that kind of thing, and the springs are not as high quality as the race springs we use. The race springs we like Eibach, we like Hypercoil, we like Magnitude. There's a few others, but those are the 3 big ones we like. Some of the other ones are cheaper, but are hot wound and therefore don't last as long and have a big deflection factor. But the race springs last longer, so they can do more cycles without taking a bit of a sag. So once your spring starts to sag, and every spring will take a bit of a set after a few miles, but it should be good for a while. Once it starts to sag again, I test it. I put it on my spring rater and I collapse it from 14 inches down to 10 or 12 and see if it's rating, like say it's a 300-pound spring and it gives me 300 on the first inch and 300 on the second inch and third and the fourth, I'll keep combining at 300 inches, I'm okay with a spring. But if it goes 300, 280, 250, 300, I know that somewhere in there we have slightly fractured the wire and it bends at a slightly different moment, and I'll throw that spring away. I think that's it. Okay. Something I wanted to go over. We did all that spring calc, lots of room. Again, the measurement here to here, and then here to here, because that's the room that will be on the shock. I forgot something. Sometimes you have a spring perch that has a relief in it, and it will go over top of the shock like this, right? So now you don't have exactly that amount of spring room. You have to take away the 1 inch of treble from the raised spring perch, depending on how far it recesses in here, because that raises the whole spring up onto the shock to here, and you have to take that measurement and subtract that from this actual measurement. So if we did this calc and we were dead on, but we're still coil binding, and then we'd look and we forgot to take that measurement out, and it would be 1 inch less on this particular shock. So that's just something I remembered and I wanted to let you know. Hope it helps.